On the afternoon of July 23, 2014, inside the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, Joseph Rudolph Wood III lay strapped to a gurney. At exactly 1:52 p.m., the state of Arizona began his execution by lethal injection. He was 55 years old, convicted of murdering his girlfriend, Deborah Deetsz, and her father, Eugene, in Tucson 25 years earlier. Wood's crime had been swift and brutal, carried out in the open during a morning of routine work at the family's auto body shop. Yet his execution was anything but swift. What was supposed to be a carefully controlled procedure stretched into nearly 2 hours, as witnesses watched in shock while he gasped and struggled for air over 600 times before he was finally declared dead at 3:49 p.m. For the victims' families, it was a day they had waited decades to see, a moment of closure for 2 lives violently taken. But for many others, it became something else entirely. A chilling spectacle that reignited national debate over the death penalty, lethal injection, and the fine line between justice and cruelty. Deborah Deetz had been just 29 years old, a bright young woman who had built her life around family and hard work. Eugene, her father, was 55, a man who had built his business with his own hands, only to die protecting his daughter. Both were gunned down in front of colleagues and police officers, in a crime that left no doubt about the killer's identity. And at the center of it all was Joseph Wood. To some, he was nothing more than a remorseless murderer who deserved the fate handed to him. To others, he became a symbol of a broken execution system, an example of how the state's pursuit of death can spiral into something disturbingly inhumane. 2 victims, 1 killer. An execution that shocked the world. Their story is not only about a crime, but about the questions that linger long after. But to understand how a hot-tempered man from Tucson ended up as the face of one of America's most controversial executions, how a family's tragedy spilled from a garage floor in 1989 to a death chamber in 2014, and why his final hours still echo in debates about punishment and humanity, we have to go back to 1958. Back to a childhood scarred by instability and alcohol. Back to the beginnings of Joseph Rudolph Wood's descent into violence. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Joseph Rudolph Wood III was born in 1958 into a military family that never stayed in one place long enough to call home. His father served in the United States Army, which meant constant relocations across different states and military bases. The frequent moves prevented young Joseph from forming lasting friendships or developing stable relationships with peers his age. Family members later described Joseph's father as a man who struggled with alcohol addiction. The drinking problem created tension within the household and affected how the family functioned on a daily basis. Joseph witnessed arguments between his parents and experienced the unpredictable behavior that often accompanies alcohol dependency. During his childhood, Joseph showed signs of difficulty adapting to new environments. Each move required starting over at a new school, meeting new teachers, and trying to fit in with unfamiliar classmates. As Joseph entered his teenage years, he began experimenting with substances himself. The combination of family instability and substance use created a foundation for future problems. Joseph's educational background remained inconsistent due to the frequent relocations. He attended multiple schools across different states but never established strong academic performance or extracurricular involvement. Teachers and school administrators had little opportunity to identify warning signs or provide intervention. By his early 20s, Joseph had developed a pattern of unemployment and difficulty maintaining steady work. He moved between different jobs without establishing a career path or developing professional skills. This employment instability would later affect his relationships and financial security. Before his arrival in Arizona, Joseph had already encountered the criminal justice system. In Las Vegas, Nevada, he was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. The assault charge in Nevada demonstrated that Joseph had crossed a line from minor infractions to serious criminal behavior. The details of this incident showed he was capable of escalating disputes to dangerous levels. Law enforcement in Nevada processed his case, but the consequences apparently did little to change his behavior patterns. After his release in Nevada, Joseph made his way to Arizona, where he would eventually meet Deborah Deetz. Tucson's warm climate and relatively affordable cost of living attracted many newcomers seeking fresh beginnings. Joseph rented a small apartment and began the familiar pattern of searching for work while struggling with the same personal demons that had plagued him elsewhere. His lack of stable employment history and problems with authority made it difficult to find steady work, even in Tucson's expanding economy. The cycle of unemployment and temporary jobs continued in his new location. While Joseph struggled to establish himself in Tucson, he remained unaware that just miles away, a family had spent decades building exactly the kind of stability and success that had always eluded him. The stage was set for a collision between Joseph's troubled past and an unsuspecting family's future. The Deetz family had spent decades building their reputation in Tucson's automotive industry, creating the very foundation of success and stability that Joseph would come to both envy and resent. Eugene Deetz, born in 1934, came from a generation that believed in hard work and family loyalty. He learned the automotive trade through hands-on experience and eventually established his own auto body shop that would serve the Tucson community for years. Eugene's business, located in a busy commercial area of Tucson, specialized in automotive painting and body repair. He built his customer base through quality workmanship and honest business practices. Local residents trusted Eugene to restore their vehicles after accidents or to improve the appearance of older cars. His reputation for fair pricing and reliable service made the shop a fixture in the neighborhood. The shop operated as a true family business, with multiple members of the Deetz family contributing to its daily operations. Eugene's approach to business reflected his personal values of integrity and responsibility. He treated employees with respect and maintained positive relationships with suppliers and customers throughout the Tucson area. Eugene married and raised his family in Tucson, establishing deep roots in the community. His children grew up around the auto shop, learning the business from an early age. The family home was located near the shop, making it easy for Eugene to balance his work responsibilities with his role as a father and husband. As his children reached adulthood, Eugene welcomed them into the family business. This arrangement allowed him to spend time with his grown children while maintaining the shop's operations. The decision to involve family members in the business created a close-knit working environment where personal and professional relationships overlapped. Eugene's daughter Deborah showed particular interest in the automotive business and became actively involved in the shop's daily operations. Born in 1960, Deborah grew up watching her father work with cars and developed an appreciation for the craftsmanship involved in auto body repair. She learned to handle customer interactions and manage various aspects of the business. Deborah's involvement in the family business allowed her to contribute to the household income while staying close to her family. She worked alongside her father and other family members, creating a support system that extended beyond typical workplace relationships. The shop became a gathering place where family members could maintain regular contact and support each other through daily challenges. The Deetz family's social connections extended throughout Tucson's working-class community. Eugene's reputation as an honest businessman had earned him friendships with customers, suppliers, and fellow business owners across the city. These relationships created a network of acquaintances who often gathered for social events, barbecues, and community celebrations. Deborah, now in her early 20s, had inherited her father's social nature and maintained friendships with people from various backgrounds. Her involvement in the family business brought her into contact with customers and their families, expanding her social circle beyond her immediate neighborhood. She attended local events and gatherings where young people from different parts of Tucson would meet and socialize. The automotive repair community formed a particularly close-knit group with shop owners and employees, often recommending each other for work or social connections. This professional network meant that Deborah regularly met new people through business relationships, creating opportunities for romantic connections that her father generally supported as part of his daughter's normal social development. Eugene had always encouraged his children to build relationships and participate in community life. He believed that strong social connections were essential for personal happiness and business success. This philosophy meant that the Deetsz family home was often open to friends and acquaintances, creating a welcoming environment that reflected their generous nature. It was through this extensive social network that in 1984, Joseph Wood and Deborah Deetsz first crossed paths at a gathering of mutual acquaintances in Tucson. Deborah, 24 years old and established in her family's automotive business, represented everything that seemed stable and successful in life. Joseph, 26 and struggling with employment, was immediately drawn to both Deborah's confident personality and the security she represented. Their initial meeting seemed ordinary, just another social introduction in Tucson's interconnected community, but it marked the beginning of a relationship that would define both their futures. Deborah possessed qualities that attracted Joseph immediately. She had steady employment, close family relationships, and financial security through her involvement in the Deetsz family business. Her confident manner and established place in the community contrasted sharply with Joseph's unstable background. For someone who had moved frequently throughout his childhood and struggled to maintain employment, Deborah represented everything he lacked. Joseph's charm during the early stages of their relationship masked the warning signs that would later become apparent. He could be attentive and romantic when he wanted to make a good impression. Deborah saw potential in Joseph and believed she could help him establish stability in his life. Her caring nature and strong family values made her want to support someone who seemed to need guidance and encouragement. The couple began spending increasing amounts of time together, and Joseph became a regular presence in Deborah's life. She introduced him to her family, including her father Eugene, who remained cautious about his daughter's new boyfriend. Eugene's years of experience in business had taught him to read people quickly, and something about Joseph concerned him from the beginning. Despite Eugene's reservations, the Deetsz family welcomed Joseph into their social circle. They included him in family dinners and gatherings, treating him with the same hospitality they showed to other family friends. This acceptance meant that Joseph had access to the family's personal lives and business operations, information he would later use against them. As the relationship progressed, Joseph's employment problems became more apparent. He struggled to maintain steady work and often relied on Deborah for financial support. This dependency created an imbalance in their relationship, with Deborah taking on the role of provider, while Joseph contributed little to their shared expenses. The financial strain affected both partners, but in different ways. Deborah's income from the family business allowed her to support both herself and Joseph, but this arrangement created resentment on both sides. Joseph felt embarrassed by his inability to contribute financially, while Deborah grew frustrated with supporting someone who seemed unwilling or unable to improve his situation. The money issues became a source of ongoing conflict between them. Joseph's personality began to change as the relationship continued. The charm and attention he had shown during their courtship gave way to controlling behavior and unrealistic expectations. He became possessive of Deborah's time and attention, particularly when she was working at the family business. His jealousy extended to her relationships with family members and coworkers. The Deetsz family auto shop became a focal point for Joseph's resentment. He disliked that Deborah spent long hours working with her father and other family members. Joseph saw the close-knit family relationships as competition for Deborah's loyalty and attention. His growing hostility toward the family business created tension during family gatherings and social events. Eugene Deetsz recognized the negative changes in Joseph's behavior and began limiting his access to the auto shop during business hours. On several occasions, Eugene refused to allow Joseph to visit Deborah while she was working. These restrictions were intended to protect both Deborah and the business environment, but they further inflamed Joseph's resentment toward Eugene specifically. The stage was set for escalating conflict as Joseph's problems with employment, finances, and relationships converged around his involvement with the Deetsz family. What had begun as a promising relationship was transforming into something much more dangerous. Joseph's frustrations with his inability to control Deborah's time and activities were building toward a breaking point that would soon manifest in ways that shocked everyone who knew them. Joseph's mounting resentments and feelings of powerlessness began to express themselves through physical aggression toward the person he blamed for his problems. The first signs of physical violence in Joseph and Deborah's relationship appeared within months of their initial meeting, coinciding with his growing frustration about her family connections and work commitments. Joseph had struck Deborah during arguments, behavior that initially shocked her but gradually became normalized as the relationship continued. These incidents typically occurred in private, away from family members and friends who might have intervened. Deborah initially believed that Joseph's violent outbursts were isolated incidents caused by stress from his unemployment and personal problems. She made excuses for his behavior and convinced herself that she could help him change. This response reflected patterns common in abusive relationships, where victims often blame themselves or external circumstances, rather than recognizing the deliberate nature of their partner's actions. Joseph's violence followed predictable patterns that experts recognize as typical of domestic abuse. He would become aggressive during arguments, particularly when Deborah challenged his opinions or made decisions without consulting him. After violent incidents, he would apologize and promise to change, creating a cycle that kept Deborah hoping for improvement while experiencing repeated harm. The physical abuse escalated gradually over time, with Joseph testing boundaries to see what behavior Deborah would accept. Initially, he might grab her arm roughly during arguments. Later incidents involved pushing, slapping, and eventually more serious physical attacks. Each escalation established a new baseline for acceptable behavior in their relationship. Deborah attempted to hide the abuse from her family members, particularly her father Eugene. She wore long sleeves to cover bruises and made excuses for any visible injuries. Her efforts to protect Joseph from consequences reflected her ongoing hope that the relationship could be salvaged and her fear of what might happen if the abuse became public knowledge. Eugene Deetsz eventually noticed changes in his daughter's behavior and appearance that suggested something was wrong in her relationship. Deborah became more withdrawn during family gatherings and seemed nervous when Joseph was present. Eugene's protective instincts as a father made him increasingly suspicious of Joseph's influence on his daughter. The abuse affected Deborah's work performance and relationships with family members. She became less reliable at the auto shop and seemed distracted during conversations with customers and coworkers. Her previously confident manner was replaced by hesitation and anxiety, particularly when Joseph called or visited the business during work hours. Joseph's control over Deborah extended beyond physical violence to include emotional manipulation and isolation tactics. He criticized her relationships with family members and tried to convince her that they disapproved of their relationship. These efforts were designed to weaken Deborah's support system and increase her dependence on Joseph for emotional validation. Financial control became another tool in Joseph's abuse strategy. Since Deborah supported him financially, he felt entitled to make demands about how she spent her money and time. He objected to purchases she made for herself or gifts she gave to family members, claiming that these expenditures showed she didn't care about their relationship. The pattern of abuse created a prison of fear and confusion for Deborah. She loved Joseph and remembered the positive aspects of their early relationship, but she also feared his violent reactions to perceived slights or challenges. This internal conflict prevented her from seeking help or ending the relationship, even as the danger increased. By the summer of 1989, Deborah Deetsz had endured 5 years of physical and emotional abuse from Joseph Wood. The relationship that had begun with promise and affection had deteriorated into a cycle of violence, apologies, and temporary reconciliations. Deborah's hope for positive change was gradually being replaced by fear and exhaustion as Joseph's behavior became increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. The July 4th weekend of 1989 marked a turning point in their relationship. During a particularly intense argument, Joseph's violence crossed new boundaries that finally convinced Deborah that the relationship could not continue. The specific details of this incident were severe enough to overcome her previous willingness to forgive and forget. For the first time in 5 years, Deborah made the decision to end the relationship permanently. Deborah's announcement that she wanted to break up triggered an explosive reaction from Joseph. He could not accept that she was choosing to leave him, particularly after he had become financially dependent on her support. The rejection threatened his sense of control and challenged his belief that Deborah belonged to him. His response combined rage, desperation, and disbelief. Rather than accepting Deborah's decision with dignity, Joseph began a campaign of harassment and intimidation designed to force her to reconsider. He called her repeatedly at home and at the auto shop, refusing to accept that she no longer wanted to speak with him. These phone calls often included threats, pleading, and attempts to manipulate her emotions through guilt and false promises of change. Deborah moved out of the apartment she had shared with Joseph and returned to live with her parents. This decision provided her with physical safety and emotional support from family members who had worried about her well-being throughout the relationship. However, the move also made it clear to Joseph that the breakup was serious and not just a temporary separation. Joseph's reaction to Deborah's departure revealed the extent of his rage and lack of self-control. He returned to their shared apartment and systematically destroyed Deborah's belongings and damaged the property. This vandalism served both as revenge against Deborah and as a way for Joseph to express his anger about losing control over the relationship. The destruction of property represented more than just physical damage. It demonstrated Joseph's willingness to cross legal boundaries when he felt wronged. The vandalism also showed that he blamed Deborah for the end of their relationship rather than acknowledging his own role in creating an abusive situation. This inability to accept responsibility would prove to be a dangerous characteristic. Recognizing that Joseph's behavior was escalating beyond normal breakup difficulties, Deborah took legal action to protect herself. On July 8, 1989, she obtained a protective order against Joseph through the court system. This legal document prohibited him from contacting her or coming near her home, workplace, or family members. The protective order provided Deborah with legal recourse if Joseph violated its terms, but it also represented a public acknowledgement that their relationship had become dangerous. For someone who had tried to keep the abuse private, seeking legal protection was a significant step that demonstrated her growing fear of what Joseph might do. Joseph's response to the protective order was to ignore its restrictions and continue attempting to contact Deborah through various means. He called the auto shop repeatedly, forcing Eugene and other family members to hang up on him. He also tried to approach Deborah at locations where he thought she might be, violating the court's explicit instructions. The weeks following the protective order were filled with tension for the Deetsz family. They knew that Joseph was angry and unpredictable, but they hoped that time would allow him to accept the situation and move on with his life. Unfortunately, Joseph's behavior suggested that he was becoming more obsessed with regaining control over Deborah rather than less dangerous. Deborah tried to rebuild her life after the breakup by focusing on work and family relationships. However, Joseph's continued harassment made it difficult for her to feel safe or move forward emotionally. However, during one particularly disturbing phone call, Joseph directly threatened Eugene, telling him that he would get him back and that Eugene would be sorry for interfering in the relationship. This threat represented a significant escalation from Joseph's previous focus on Deborah to include her father as a target of his rage. Eugene took the threat seriously, but hoped that Joseph would eventually calm down and move on. 3 days before the devastating act, Joseph left threatening messages on Deborah's answering machine that provided clear evidence of his intent to harm her. These recorded messages contained explicit threats against Deborah's life and demonstrated that Joseph had moved beyond hoping for reconciliation to planning violence. The threatening phone messages revealed the depth of Joseph's rage and his specific plans to harm Deborah. He spoke in detail about what he intended to do to her, using language that left no doubt about his violent intentions. As August 7, 1989 dawned, Joseph Wood was ready to carry out his plan of revenge against the Deetsz family, while his intended victims were preparing for what they thought would be another ordinary day at work. The night before, Joseph had made his final mental preparations, checking his .38 caliber revolver and ensuring he had enough ammunition for what he planned to do. He had already chosen his route to the auto shop and knew exactly when the family typically arrived for work. Joseph woke early that Monday morning, his mind focused entirely on the violence he intended to commit. There was no hesitation or second-guessing in his thoughts. The weeks of planning had crystallized into a clear mission of revenge against people he blamed for destroying his relationship with Deborah. He dressed methodically and prepared to leave his residence, carrying the loaded weapon that would soon end 2 lives. Before leaving for the auto shop, Joseph began making phone calls to confirm his targets would be present. He called the shop multiple times that morning, speaking with employees other than Deborah and Eugene. His questions were carefully crafted to gather intelligence without revealing his true intentions. He asked who was at work, when they would be available, and whether both Deborah and Eugene were on the premises. The employees who answered Joseph's calls had no reason to suspect anything unusual about his inquiries. They provided the information he requested, unknowingly helping him conduct final reconnaissance before his attack. These calls served as the last step in Joseph's preparation, confirming that his intended victims were present and accessible. While Joseph was making his surveillance calls and final preparations for murder, the Deetsz family was beginning their morning routine without any awareness of the danger approaching them. Eugene set his alarm for the same time he had used for years, planning to arrive at the shop early enough to review the day's scheduled work and prepare for customer appointments. The contrast between Joseph's deadly intentions and the Deetsz family's normal Monday morning routine could not have been more stark. Eugene and Deborah arrived at their auto shop early to prepare for the day's work, completely unaware that Joseph Wood was already positioning himself to watch their movements and finalize his plans for violence. Eugene Deetsz, 55 years old and experienced in running his business, expected Monday to bring the usual mix of customer consultations, repair estimates, and administrative tasks. He had worked in the automotive industry for decades and took pride in maintaining professional standards even during personal difficulties. His focus that morning was on serving customers and managing the shop's operations. Deborah, 29 years old and still recovering emotionally from her abusive relationship with Joseph, was trying to rebuild her sense of normalcy through work and family connections. The auto shop represented safety and stability in her life, a place where she could focus on productive activities while surrounded by supportive family members. She had no reason to expect that this Monday would be different from any other. 6 other employees were present at the shop that morning, creating a busy and productive work environment. The presence of multiple workers meant that the shop was functioning at full capacity, with various projects underway simultaneously. This normal level of activity would later provide multiple witnesses to the violence that was about to unfold. At 8:50 a.m., a Tucson police officer noticed Joseph Wood driving in a suspicious manner near the auto shop. The officer's trained observation skills detected something unusual about Joseph's behavior behind the wheel, though at the time there was no specific reason to intervene. This sighting would later prove significant as evidence of Joseph's premeditation and planning. The police officer's observation of Joseph near the shop demonstrated that he had been conducting surveillance and waiting for the right moment to act. His driving pattern suggested nervousness or agitation, behaviors consistent with someone preparing to commit a violent crime. Joseph parked his truck and approached the auto shop on foot, carrying a .38 caliber revolver that he had brought specifically for this purpose. His decision to bring a loaded weapon to the shop proved that he intended to use lethal force against his targets. The gun was not a tool for intimidation or threats. It was an instrument of murder. Inside the shop, Eugene was engaged in a business phone call, discussing automotive repair details with a customer or supplier. His conversation was taking place in an area where other employees could hear him, making his location obvious to anyone entering the building. Joseph observed Eugene's position and waited for the phone call to end before approaching him. When Eugene concluded his phone call and hung up the receiver, Joseph approached to within 4 feet of him and drew his revolver. Other employees in the area immediately recognized the danger and shouted warnings, telling Joseph to put the gun away. Their urgent voices filled the shop as they realized what was about to happen. The employees' attempts to intervene showed that there was still time for Joseph to reconsider his actions and leave the shop without harming anyone. Without responding to the employees' warnings or saying anything to Eugene, Joseph fired his revolver once into Eugene's chest at close range. The bullet caused massive internal damage, and Eugene collapsed immediately. After shooting Eugene, Joseph smiled, revealing his satisfaction with the act of murder he had just committed. The sound of the gunshot that killed Eugene Deetsz echoed through the auto shop, creating immediate chaos among the employees and customers present. The police officer, who had observed him driving suspiciously, immediately called for backup when she witnessed the shooting through the shop windows. Joseph left the building briefly after shooting Eugene, but his departure was only temporary. Within minutes, he returned to the shop and pointed his revolver at Eugene's motionless body, demonstrating that his desire for violence had not been satisfied by the first murder. This return to the scene showed that Joseph was operating according to a plan that included multiple targets. Before we go further into this case, take a second to hit subscribe and turn on the bell. No Way Out brings you real cases, real consequences, every week. Alright, let's get back to the story. Donald Deetsz, Eugene's 70-year-old brother and fellow employee, attempted to physically intervene when he saw Joseph threatening his fallen brother's body. Despite the obvious danger and his advanced age, Donald tried to wrestle the gun away from Joseph. This brave attempt to stop the violence put Donald's own life at risk, but demonstrated the family's loyalty and courage under extreme circumstances. Joseph overpowered the elderly Donald Deetsz and broke free from his grasp, then began searching the shop for Deborah. His systematic hunt for his second target proved that he had planned to murder both Eugene and Deborah from the beginning. The shooting of Eugene was not sufficient to satisfy his rage. He needed to complete his plan by killing the woman who had rejected him. Deborah had heard the commotion when her father was shot and realized that Joseph was in the building with a gun. She attempted to call for help using the shop's telephone, but Joseph found her before she could complete the call. Joseph approached Deborah from behind and grabbed her around the neck, positioning her so that he could place his revolver directly against her chest. This intimate positioning for the murder reflected the personal nature of his grievance against her. He wanted to ensure that she understood who was killing her and why she was going to die. Deborah struggled against Joseph's grip and screamed, "No, Joe, don't," as she realized what was about to happen. Her plea for mercy represented a final appeal to whatever humanity might remain in someone she had once loved. However, Joseph had already decided that she deserved to die for rejecting him and would not be swayed by her desperation. Another employee heard Joseph say, "I told you I was going to do it. I have to kill you," before he shot Deborah. Joseph then called Deborah a derogatory name and fired 2 more shots into her chest at point-blank range. The close contact and multiple shots ensured that the wounds would be fatal. Deborah collapsed near her father's body, and both victims lay dying in pools of their own blood, while their killer prepared to face the police response that was already underway. The 17 minutes between Joseph's arrival at the shop and the conclusion of his shooting spree had resulted in 2 murders and terrorized multiple witnesses. Several police officers had arrived at the scene while Joseph was inside the shop, committing the murders. Their quick response prevented him from potentially harming additional victims or escaping from the area. The officers positioned themselves around the building and prepared to arrest him when he emerged. Joseph finally left the shop after completing his planned murders and faced the armed police officers who were waiting for him. The officers ordered him to surrender, but Joseph initially complied with their commands, only to suddenly grab his weapon again and point it toward them. This action forced the officers to defend themselves and others by using lethal force. The police officers' use of force against Joseph was justified by his threatening actions and his demonstrated willingness to kill innocent people. They had witnessed him murder 2 people and had to assume that he remained dangerous to anyone in the area. Their response followed proper procedures for dealing with an armed suspect who had just committed multiple murders. Joseph was wounded by police gunfire, but survived his injuries, ensuring that he would face trial for the murders he had committed. The Tucson Police Department had transformed the Deetsz family auto shop into an active crime scene. Detective teams arrived to begin the complex process of documenting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a criminal case against Joseph Wood. The investigation would need to establish not only what had happened, but also prove the premeditation that would support first-degree murder charges. The crime scene itself told a clear story of deliberate violence. Eugene Deetz's body lay where he had fallen after being shot, with evidence of the close-range gunshot wound that had killed him instantly. Deborah Deetz had died near her father, her body showing the effects of 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. The positioning of the victims and the physical evidence supported witness accounts of how the murders had occurred. Investigators found Joseph's .38 caliber revolver at the scene, along with spent shell casings that matched the weapon. Ballistics testing would later confirm that this gun had fired the bullets that killed both victims. The presence of the murder weapon eliminated any possibility that someone else had been responsible for the shootings. 6 employees had witnessed various aspects of the murders, providing investigators with multiple perspectives on Joseph's actions and demeanor during the attack. These witnesses described his calm, methodical approach to the killings and his apparent satisfaction after shooting Eugene. Their testimonies would prove crucial in establishing premeditation and contradicting any potential claims of temporary insanity. The police officer who had observed Joseph driving suspiciously near the shop provided additional evidence of his planning and intent. Her testimony established that Joseph had been conducting surveillance before the attack, undermining any argument that the murders were spontaneous reactions to unexpected circumstances. Investigators discovered that Joseph had made multiple phone calls to the auto shop on the morning of the murders, asking employees about who was present and when they would be available. These calls provided clear evidence of premeditation and planning. The pattern of surveillance calls showed that Joseph had been gathering intelligence before launching his attack. The threatening phone messages that Joseph had left on Deborah's answering machine 3 days before the murders provided prosecutors with additional evidence of premeditation. These recordings captured Joseph's explicit threats against Deborah's life and demonstrated his intent to harm her. The messages would become powerful evidence during the trial. Within 48 hours of the murders, investigators had compiled sufficient evidence to support multiple felony charges against Joseph Wood. The strength of the case meant that prosecutors could focus on seeking the maximum possible punishment rather than worrying about whether they could secure a conviction. Pima County prosecutors faced the task of building a death penalty case against Joseph Wood that would satisfy Arizona's legal requirements for capital punishment. The evidence collected by investigators provided a strong foundation, but prosecutors needed to demonstrate specific aggravating factors that would justify seeking the ultimate punishment. The case would require careful preparation to ensure that justice was served for the Deetsz family. The prosecution team was led by experienced attorneys who specialized in capital cases and understood the complex legal requirements for death penalty prosecutions. They recognized that the evidence clearly established Joseph's guilt, but securing a death sentence would require proving aggravating circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt. The stakes were high for both the prosecution and the victims' families. Arizona law required prosecutors to prove that the murders met specific criteria for capital punishment, including factors such as multiple victims, extreme cruelty, or commission of the crime for pecuniary gain. In Joseph's case, the presence of 2 victims and the domestic violence context provided multiple potential aggravating factors that could support a death sentence. The threatening phone messages that Joseph had left for Deborah became central evidence in establishing premeditation. Joseph Wood's defense team faced the difficult task of representing a client whose guilt was clearly established by overwhelming evidence. With 6 witnesses to the murders, recorded threats, and physical evidence linking Joseph to the crimes, the defense could not realistically claim innocence. Instead, they would need to focus on preventing a death sentence by presenting mitigating factors and challenging the prosecution's characterization of the murders. Defense attorneys recognized that their primary goal was saving Joseph's life rather than winning an acquittal. The evidence of his guilt was too strong to overcome, but they hoped to convince a jury that he deserved life in prison rather than execution. This strategy required them to present Joseph as someone whose actions, while inexcusable, were influenced by factors beyond his complete control. The defense team planned to argue that the murders were not premeditated, but rather the result of impulsive actions driven by emotional distress. They would claim that Joseph's threats against Deborah were expressions of anger rather than actual plans for murder. This strategy aimed to reduce the charges from first-degree murder to a lesser offense that would not carry the death penalty. Mental health experts would play a crucial role in the defense strategy. Attorneys planned to present evidence that Joseph suffered from psychological problems that impaired his judgment and impulse control. They hoped to show that his actions on August 7, 1989, were the result of mental illness rather than calculated evil, which might persuade jurors to show mercy. The defense team also intended to present evidence about Joseph's troubled childhood and family background. They would argue that his father's alcohol abuse and the family's frequent moves had created psychological damage that contributed to his violent behavior. This approach aimed to generate sympathy for Joseph by portraying him as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Joseph's history of substance abuse would be presented as another mitigating factor that affected his decision-making abilities. Defense attorneys planned to argue that drugs and alcohol had impaired his judgment and contributed to the violent actions that resulted in the deaths of Eugene and Deborah Deetz. They hoped this would reduce his moral culpability for the murders. The defense strategy required careful preparation to present expert testimony about the effects of childhood trauma, substance abuse, and mental illness on criminal behavior. These experts would need to explain complex psychological concepts to jurors who might not have scientific backgrounds but would be asked to consider these factors when determining Joseph's punishment. Defense attorneys also planned to challenge the prosecution's evidence of premeditation by offering alternative interpretations of Joseph's behavior. They would argue that his phone calls to the auto shop were attempts to reconcile with Deborah rather than surveillance for a planned attack. They hoped to create doubt about his true intentions on the morning of the murders. The threatening phone messages that Joseph had left for Deborah presented a significant challenge for the defense. These recordings clearly demonstrated his intent to harm her, making it difficult to argue that the murders were spontaneous. Defense attorneys would need to find ways to minimize the impact of this evidence without appearing to ignore obvious facts. Character witnesses would be called to testify about positive aspects of Joseph's personality and behavior during periods when he was not abusing drugs or alcohol. The defense hoped to show that he was capable of kindness and normal human relationships when his various problems were under control. This testimony aimed to humanize Joseph for the jury. The defense team recognized that their task was nearly impossible given the strength of the prosecution's case. However, they were obligated to provide the best possible representation for their client, even when facing overwhelming evidence of guilt. Their efforts focused on preventing his execution rather than securing his freedom. Preparation for the defense case required extensive investigation into Joseph's background, mental health history, and family circumstances. Defense attorneys needed to uncover any information that might explain or mitigate his actions without excusing the murders he had committed. The defense strategy would ultimately depend on finding jurors who were willing to consider mercy despite the horrific nature of the crimes and the compelling evidence of guilt. The trial of Joseph Wood began in Pima County Superior Court with jury selection, a crucial process that would determine whether 12 citizens could fairly weigh the evidence and decide his fate. Both prosecution and defense attorneys questioned potential jurors about their views on domestic violence, capital punishment, and their ability to consider complex evidence objectively. The process took several days as attorneys sought jurors who could handle the emotional weight of the case. The trial proceeded under intense community scrutiny, with the courtroom packed with victims' families, media, and citizens seeking justice for the shocking murders. The prosecution presented Joseph as a controlling killer who murdered 2 people for revenge, using testimony from auto shop witnesses who described his calm, methodical approach to the killings. They played Joseph's threatening voice messages to Deborah as proof of premeditation, while the medical examiner described close-range gunshot wounds that demonstrated his intent to kill. Police officers testified about his continued dangerous behavior during arrest, showing his lack of remorse. The defense argued Joseph's actions were driven by mental illness and substance abuse rather than calculated evil. Mental health experts testified about psychological problems that diminished his culpability, while character witnesses described positive aspects of his personality when sober. Defense attorneys attempted to humanize him and show potential for rehabilitation, but this evidence could not overcome the brutal nature of his crimes. The prosecution's rebuttal emphasized his deliberate choices despite personal problems, arguing that rage and revenge motivated the murders rather than mental illness. In closing arguments, prosecutors sought the death penalty for calculated revenge murders, while defense attorneys pleaded for mercy based on mitigating mental health factors. The trial essentially boiled down to whether Joseph was a calculated killer deserving death, or a mentally ill man whose problems reduced his culpability to life imprisonment. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Joseph was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Eugene and Deborah Deetsz, as well as 2 counts of aggravated assault against police officers. The convictions reflected the jury's determination that the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. During the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury was asked to decide whether Joseph should receive the death penalty or life in prison. They heard additional evidence about aggravating and mitigating factors before beginning their deliberations on the ultimate punishment. After considering all the evidence and arguments, the jury recommended that Joseph Wood be sentenced to death for each of the murder convictions. After his 1991 conviction and death sentence, Joseph Wood began a complex appeals process that would span over 2 decades. His legal team first filed a mandatory direct appeal to the Arizona Supreme Court in 1992, challenging his trial and sentencing on grounds including ineffective assistance of counsel and constitutional violations. The Arizona Supreme Court thoroughly reviewed the case and in 1994 affirmed both his convictions and death sentences, finding the trial was conducted properly and rejecting all defense arguments. Following the unsuccessful state appeal, Joseph's attorneys filed for post-conviction relief in Arizona State Court, raising additional claims about his representation and the constitutionality of his sentences. When these state proceedings also failed, His legal team moved to federal court in 2007, filing a habeas corpus petition in the U.S. District Court for the District of Arizona. This federal petition raised numerous constitutional challenges, including claims of ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and trial violations. District Court Judge John M. Roll carefully reviewed all constitutional claims over several years before denying the habeas petition in 2012, determining that Joseph had received adequate representation and a fair trial. Joseph's attorneys then appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which ultimately upheld the district court's decision and rejected his constitutional claims. Throughout this entire appeals process, Joseph remained on death row at Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, living in a single cell with limited contact and privileges. By 2014, after more than 20 years of legal proceedings, Joseph had exhausted his regular federal appeals, clearing the way for Arizona to schedule his execution. By 2014, Joseph had been on death row for more than 20 years, while his case proceeded through various levels of appeal and review. The completion of his federal appeals meant that Arizona could begin the process of scheduling his execution, bringing the legal proceedings toward their final conclusion. In early 2014, Arizona Attorney General Tom Horne began scheduling Joseph Wood's execution after more than 2 decades of legal proceedings. The state faced significant challenges due to nationwide shortages of traditional execution drugs, as pharmaceutical companies had stopped manufacturing or selling drugs specifically for executions. Arizona was forced to develop new protocols using alternative drug combinations. The state planned to execute Joseph using midazolam and hydromorphone, an experimental 2-drug combination that had been used only once before in Ohio's execution of Dennis McGuire in January 2014. McGuire's execution had taken 25 minutes with visible signs of distress, raising serious questions about the effectiveness and humanity of this drug protocol. Joseph's legal team, led by federal public defender Dale Bache, mounted constitutional challenges, arguing the experimental drugs violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. They also claimed Joseph had a First Amendment right to know details about the execution drugs and procedures. The challenge focused on Arizona's secrecy policies that refused to identify drug sources or execution team qualifications. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals initially agreed with the defense and issued a stay of execution, finding that the secrecy violated the public's First Amendment rights. However, the Supreme Court quickly reversed this decision and lifted the stay, allowing Arizona to proceed while maintaining its secrecy policies. Judge Alex Kozinski wrote a notable dissent arguing that lethal injection was fundamentally flawed and states should return to more traditional methods like firing squads. After last-minute appeals were denied, all parties prepared for the execution scheduled for July 23, 2014. Prison officials conducted final preparations, media witnesses gathered, and the execution team expected a standard 10-minute procedure. However, the experimental nature of the drug protocol would soon prove problematic. At 1:52 p.m. on July 23, 2014, Joseph Wood was led into the execution chamber at Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence and strapped to a gurney. Medical personnel inserted intravenous lines into his arms to deliver the lethal drugs, while witnesses watched through observation windows. The execution was expected to take approximately 10 minutes. Following the typical timeline for lethal injection procedures, Joseph delivered his final statement, looking toward the family members of his victims and saying, "I take comfort knowing today my pain stops, and I said a prayer that on this or any other day you may find peace in all of your hearts, and may God forgive you all." His words angered some family members who felt he was attempting to portray himself as a victim, rather than taking responsibility for his crimes. At 1:57 p.m., prison officials announced that Joseph was sedated and the execution was proceeding normally. The initial administration of midazolam and hydromorphone appeared to be working as expected, with Joseph closing his eyes and appearing to lose consciousness. Witnesses observed no unusual activity during the first few minutes of the procedure. However, At approximately 2:02 p.m., Joseph began to breathe visibly and his mouth moved, indicating that he was not as deeply sedated as expected. Over the following minutes, his breathing became more pronounced and appeared labored. Witnesses described his breathing pattern as gasping or snorting, which was not typical for lethal injection procedures. As the execution continued, Joseph's breathing became increasingly noticeable to witnesses. Media observers described his breathing as resembling a fish gasping for air or someone snoring loudly. The sounds and visible chest movements continued for much longer than anyone expected, creating an atmosphere of tension in the witness areas. Prison medical staff checked on Joseph's condition multiple times during the extended procedure, confirming that he remained deeply sedated despite the visible breathing. Officials maintained that his reflexive breathing was a normal bodily response and that he was not conscious or suffering. However, the prolonged nature of the execution concerned witnesses and officials. At approximately 3 p.m., more than an hour after the execution began, Joseph's attorneys filed an emergency motion with federal courts requesting that the execution be halted. The motion argued that the prolonged procedure violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment and requested that courts order prison officials to provide life-saving medical intervention. The emergency motion described Joseph as gasping and snorting for more than an hour and argued that he was still alive despite repeated doses of lethal drugs. Defense attorneys claimed that the execution had become an unlawful experiment that was causing unnecessary suffering. They requested immediate intervention to stop the procedure. Justice Anthony Kennedy of the Supreme Court reviewed the emergency appeal but denied the request for intervention. The decision came approximately 30 minutes after Joseph was finally pronounced dead, making the legal appeal moot. The federal courts did not have an opportunity to review the execution while it was still ongoing. Throughout the extended procedure, prison officials administered a total of 15 doses of the lethal drug combination, far exceeding the single dose that was supposed to be sufficient to cause death. Joseph was finally pronounced dead at 3:49 p.m., 1 hour and 57 minutes after the execution began. The total time made it the longest execution in modern United States history and raised serious questions about Arizona's lethal injection protocol. The extended time frame shocked witnesses and officials who had expected a routine procedure. Medical personnel confirmed Joseph's death and began the process of removing his body from the execution chamber. The controversial execution of Joseph Wood prompted immediate calls for investigation and accountability from various quarters. Governor Jan Brewer announced within hours of the execution that she had ordered the Arizona Department of Corrections to conduct a comprehensive review of what had occurred. The governor expressed concern about the length of the procedure while maintaining that justice had been served. Dale Bache, Joseph's attorney who had witnessed the execution, described it as a horrifically botched execution that demonstrated the failure of Arizona's experimental drug protocol. He argued that the state had conducted an unconstitutional experiment on his client and called for transparency about the drugs used and the qualifications of execution personnel. The Deetsz family members who witnessed the execution had mixed reactions to what they observed. Jean Brown, sister of victim Deborah Deetsz, stated that she believed Joseph had died peacefully and that any suffering he experienced was minimal compared to what her father and sister had endured. She dismissed concerns about the extended timeline as media exaggeration. Arizona Department of Corrections Director Charles Ryan defended the execution procedures, stating that Joseph had been deeply sedated throughout the process and had not experienced pain or distress. Ryan emphasized that the execution team had followed all established protocols and that the unusual breathing was a normal bodily response during the dying process. Medical examiner Dr. Gregory Hess conducted an autopsy on Joseph's body and reported that the intravenous lines had been properly placed and that the drugs had entered his system as intended. Following the controversial execution of Joseph Wood, Arizona entered an 8-year period without carrying out any death sentences. The state officially suspended executions on July 24, 2014, pending a comprehensive review of procedures and legal challenges to the lethal injection protocol. This moratorium would become one of the longest voluntary suspensions of capital punishment in Arizona's history. Before we close, remember, cases like Joseph Wood's aren't just about one man and his crimes. They're about victims whose lives were cut short, families left shattered, and a justice system that still struggles with questions of fairness, punishment, and humanity. If you want to keep exploring these real stories of crime, consequence, and the people caught in between, make sure you subscribe to No Way Out. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next case, because every execution tells more than just one story. It tells us about choices, justice, and the price of crossing a line you can never uncross. Stay with us. More cases are coming.